It's 2021, and the Nintendo 3DS has been in the news, with some recent stories about the accidental removal of some titles from the eShop. But one thing is clear, as of last September, the 3DS family was officially discontinued. And with that, I decided that it was time to take a closer look at the new Nintendo 3DS XL. Last week, I decided to pick up a 3DS for $100 complete in the box, and what a beauty it is. The system is minty fresh, and it looks amazing. This is the new Nintendo 3DS LL. What is an LL edition, you might ask? Well, in Japan, the letter X is not used to describe sizes, so rather than XL, it becomes LL, simple enough. Aside from that, there are no differences at all with the North American new Nintendo 3DS XL, other than the firmware and the language. But back to the system. For me, the 3DS is still a seriously awesome handheld to use in 2021, and it's a true handheld system that packs a punch. Nintendo claims that you can get from 3.5 to 6 hours of battery life on it for 3DS games, and it should last around 2 to 3 days in sleep mode, which is great for those long trips. The system weighs around 8 ounces and comes with dual screens. Because of the built-in 3D, the top screen runs at 800 by 240 pixels wide. Now this field of view is for the 3D effect. What's actually going on here is that each eye is allocated 400 pixels. So if we disable the 3D, for all intents and purposes, the resolution is 400 by 240. The bottom screen is touch enabled and runs at 320 by 240. The new Nintendo 3DS supports 2.4 GHz wireless, and you can still pair it up with modern Wi-Fi routers and hotspots. As of 2021, you can still browse the internet just fine. Now of course, the 3DS including the new Nintendo 3DS line is home to some incredible games, and that alone is compelling enough to still use in 2021. But one problem that I have with this new Nintendo 3DS LL is that it's region locked, which means none of my collection of games will work on this Japanese 3DS. But one way to address it, of course, and the reason for this video, is to mod the device and open it up for homebrew and region-free gaming. Now, as we know, the new 3DS XL or LL, which is the version that we have here, makes a very fine machine. It's a very awesome handheld. But what makes it even better is when you mod it for homebrew, and we can do some really awesome things to it. Let's go ahead and take a closer look. So we're going to go ahead and get this new Nintendo 3DS LL modded for homebrew and change the region on it. Now, in the past, I've shied away from doing guides on my videos on how to do this stuff because, generally speaking, these guides tend to become obsolete every 6 months or so. The last time I made a video about modding a 3DS or a 2DS was the new 2DS XL that I did last year, and I will tell you that the way to homebrew a new Nintendo 3DS has completely changed since that video. So how do we mod this 3DS for homebrew? I'm going to direct you to a website that has the most up-to-date information and always will, 3ds.hacks.guide. This will show you step by step how to mod any Nintendo 2DS or 3DS all the way up to the latest revision, and it's all here. I recommend that you don't look at YouTube guides and follow along with this website. As an example of this, last year I ended up modding a new 2DS XL, and I used a method that was known as Seed Miner, and I had to access DSiWare for it to work. That process took around 35 minutes from start to finish. The 3DS scene moves fast, and now there is a newer method that utilizes a web exploit instead. And now you can homebrew up a 3DS in around 5 minutes. Just follow the steps on the 3ds.hacks.guide website and you'll be up and running in no time, as I am here. As part of the guide, one piece of homebrew that you'll be using a lot of is Luma 3DS. Essentially, this is a noob-friendly custom firmware. It allows for patches to be applied on the fly to the current Nintendo 3DS operating system that you are running. Luma 3DS has many features, but what we are most interested in is the ability to run homebrew and allowing for region-free games. And setting this up was much easier than expected. Now that we have our 3DS modded for homebrew, one thing you'll notice is if we put our US region game Mario Kart into this Japanese new Nintendo 3DS XL, you can see that now we can play region-free games. We are playing Mario Kart from a North American region on our Japanese new Nintendo 3DS. So the question now becomes, do I really need to region change this? My initial thought for this was to change the region of the 3DS from Japanese to North American. And to do this, I would need to essentially flash a North American NAND image onto my system. But there's no real reason to do this anymore, and there are risks of bricking your system if you take this approach. 3ds.hacks.guide themselves also recommend there's no reason to flash a new NAND image anymore. They also mention the risks of that the eShop may no longer be accessible, so I'm going to leave the system as Japanese region and let Luma 3DS do its thing. I can still play my batch of original games just fine as they are, and of course, we can still load some Homebrew. And with that, let's take a closer look. Right off the bat, one of the coolest pieces of Homebrew that's come out in recent times is undoubtedly Twilight Menu++. This is a really great utility that allows you to play Nintendo DS and DSiWare games directly from your SD card on your 3DS. But it also adds some really cool features, such as a cheat manager and even widescreen support for some games. It also contains built-in emulators for Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, Sega Genesis, Super NES, and more. Playing GBA games using Twilight Menu does work pretty well, but it's not optimal, however, as it's using an emulator known as GBA Runner 2 that's been around for a while and does have its issues. But just note that you can also install ROMs directly as Virtual Console titles, which has a much higher level of compatibility. But this isn't the fault of the Twilight Menu, which is really easy to use and configure, and it's a must-install app for anyone that wants to play DS and DSiWare games on their Homebrew-enabled 3DS. A slightly more controversial piece of Homebrew is the Super Mario 64 port. The 3DS version is exceptional. It's hands down better than the official Mario 3D All-Stars version of Mario 64 that ran on the Nintendo Switch. This port offers 16:9 widescreen mode, and there's also 60 FPS patches that can be applied to make the game run even better overall. This is a really impressive port, and it's awesome to see it running on the Nintendo 3DS. And speaking of Nintendo 64, I covered its emulation on my 2DS XL video a few months back. Daedalus X64 is still very much in beta, and hasn't been updated since March of last year. But for those that didn't catch the 2DS XL episode, the 3DS is more than capable of running Nintendo 64 games, with a homebrew emulator known as Daedalus 64. Overall, it's impressive, and there is a lot of potential here, and will only continue to get better. And probably my favourite piece of homebrew available on the 3DS in recent times is Devolution X. This is the reverse-engineered Diablo engine, which I incidentally ported over to the Switch as homebrew back in 2019. It's now available on the 3DS, and this is a very impressive port. Not only does it support direct input via the analog sticks and face buttons, you can also use the stylus to simulate the mouse. And to cap it off, it even runs in widescreen mode. I absolutely love this port, and great job to the developers who made all this possible on the Nintendo 3DS. Another great feature of homebrewing your 3DS is the ability to dump your cartridges to your SD card and install them. When we set up Homebrew on our new Nintendo 3DS LL, the tool known as God Mode 9 is a file browser, but also had some really powerful features, including the ability to run scripts and dump games. To dump your games, turn off your Nintendo 3DS, insert your game cartridge, turn it back on, load into God Mode 9, select the dump as .cia option and let it do its thing. You'll need an SD card large enough to store your dump game. And from here, you can run a tool known as FBI to install the .cia file. No, that wasn't a joke either. The .cia extension allows you to install the game and have it available on your home menu. Once we run FBI to select our .cia file after a few minutes, we will see it appear in our home menu. And from here, we can run our game directly off the SD card, and we don't need to resort to the original game cartridge. Also keep in mind that this is completely region free. And we've just scratched the surface of what's possible. And that's what makes the homebrew scene on the 3DS so cool. It has an amazing mix of emulators, ports, and utilities to bring together your library of DSi, DSiWare, 3DS, Virtual Console, and add other cool features like themes, custom firmwares, and have everything run from your SD card to have the ultimate handheld for gaming on the go. And although Nintendo stopped production of the 3DS hardware last year, the homebrew scene isn't going anywhere, and in many ways represents the best and most interesting one that's out there right now. If you haven't modded your 2DS or 3DS, you should really consider it. It truly does open up a whole new world for you to discover. So there you have it, guys. That is the new Nintendo 3DS LL that we modded for Homebrew, installed some really cool emulators and played some games. But that's not all. We will be giving away the very same new Nintendo 3DS LL that you saw in this episode to one lucky winner. Get yourself entered by clicking on the competition link in the description below. I will be drawing the winner on Twitter, so make sure that you are following me on Twitter, and best of luck. So we're going to leave it here for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, leave me a thumbs up, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.